Hello, everyone, and welcome to the virtual Fairfield Museum. My name is Laurie Pasteryak, and I'm here to give you a little history bite today on a gentleman named Gideon Nichols, and to also talk a little bit about Fairfield's Civil War history, as it is Memorial Day this week, and Memorial Day came out of post-Civil War America, but also to talk a little bit about Fairfield's military contributions during the Civil War, which is something that we don't often highlight here at the museum. So today, the Fairfield Museum is closed to the public, but we've been working to, of course, keep you connected to our museum and the content and all of the things that we do here, whether it's in our library and archives and research center or through our interpretation and exhibitions and programs. You can see all of the offerings that we've been putting together and all the programs we've been putting together online via www.fairfieldhistory.org, where you can also, if you're interested, make a contribution as a membership or as a donation. We deeply appreciate all of your support during this time, and we love, again, staying connected with you. So today, again, I'm talking a little bit about this gentleman, Gideon Nichols, who served in the Civil War and was from Greenfield Hill in Fairfield, Connecticut. But I'm going to talk a little bit about Civil War history and Connecticut's role in it as well, and as well as Fairfield's contributions to the war. So when Republican candidate President Abraham Lincoln campaigned here in Bridgeport in 1860, he then voiced his objection to slavery, and which was then, of course, widespread in the southern states, and Connecticut had been, as well as the North, had abolished slavery during this period. And the African American and Black population, as well as Native population here in Connecticut, was either free or served as domestic servants, and had been in the road to emancipation for several years and decades. But when Lincoln made a campaign stop here in Bridgeport, he of course voiced his opposition to slavery, and Connecticut's role in emancipation and understanding the free North was of course complex in a variety of ways. But the Civil War, of course, began in April of 1861, which was over 150 years ago. And that occurred, of course, in the South, which is why Connecticut doesn't often talk a lot about its role in the Civil War. But shortly after, Lincoln mobilized the Federal Army, and both Fairfield and Bridgeport and Fairfield County sent its first group of enlisted men in the following year in 1862. The first contingent was actually from both Fairfield and Westport and was organized as the 17th Connecticut Volunteer Infantry under the command of William Noble of Bridgeport. And that regiment was made up of course, primarily through men from Fairfield County, and was over 1,000 individuals. And of course, family names which are popular in Fairfield, including Wakeman and Burr and Sherwood, Perry and Jennings and Morehouse, were involved and a part of that contingent. And there's a great quote from Noble in talking about the Civil War here and their departure, saying, "Its departure was a rare scene of patriotic devotion and affection at parting. The date of its moving had become known throughout the county, and on the 3rd of September, from all its towns there thronged to Bridgeport, filling its seaside camp and the city, the kindred and friends of the regiment. They showered good speeds and blessings on their sons, and braced their hearts to be parting by pledges to keep all right and bright at the firesides of the county." And this was, of course, again, Brigadier General William H. Noble from the 17th Connecticut Volunteer Infantry. And so that's really began Connecticut's servicemen in the Civil War. However, Connecticut, of course, was supplying all sorts of goods to the Civil War to outfit soldiers and also provide military support. One of those things, of course, was buttons and the Brass Valley here in Connecticut, and that'll become important a little while longer. But Thomas Farnham says, in his book of the Fairfield, A Biography of a Community, that having regularly sent sons and daughters west for nearly a century, Fairfield detested the idea, demanded by the South, of opening Western lands to slavery, detested the thought of seeing its progeny forced to compete with slave labor in Kansas or Nebraska. When Lincoln vowed to prevent the addition of any slave territory to the Union, Fairfield applauded. And therefore, both Connecticut and Fairfield County did support the Union in the Civil War and through this fight. Over 270 men, we believe, from Fairfield served over the 5 years of the war in various regiments. So 242 survived, 22 were discharged, 4 died of disease, 22 were wounded, 13 were prisoners of war, 64 deserted, and 2 were killed, both of them at Gettysburg. 14 died from other causes. The gentleman we're going to talk about today actually did serve at Gettysburg and did not die at Gettysburg. He returned home, and sadly, Gideon Nichols died less than a year later to tuberculosis. And he's, of course, the gentleman in the photo. And so, in talking a little bit more about Gideon Nichols, we have several of his items here in the museum's collection, and we're very thankful for that because it does tell a rather untold story from Connecticut history and Fairfield history, because, of course, the Civil War didn't necessarily happen right here. The battles were not fought here. But we love this picture of Gideon Nichols because you see his face, his hair, his uniform, his sword, all of the things that made up, a Civil War soldier's uniform. He, of course, looks very young. Gideon was born in 1845 on January 9th, and he passed away on July 5th, 1866. So he was, in likelihood, when this photograph was taken, very young. He was a teenager, an older teenager. He was the son of a Fairfield farmer, which many people in Fairfield were at that time, as it was very agrarian. A gentleman and a couple named Rufus and Charity Bradley Nichols. And he served in the 2nd Light Battery, Connecticut's volunteer artillery, which was the infantry or the artillery company that was at Gettysburg, which was part of 2 military organizations or militia organizations from Bridgeport. So he mustered into the Army in 1862 of July, and he mustered out in August of 9th in 1865. So he served for a little over 3 years in the Civil War. He came back in New Haven, but of course he passed away less than a year after his return from tuberculosis. Several other of his family members died. Several other of his family members died in the 1860s. We think possibly due to tuberculosis as well. But the family lived in Greenfield Hill, and Gideon Nichols, and I'll move on to a few of his items in our collection, left us behind an amazing story and several objects. So this, in particular, is an artillery shell jacket. So Gideon actually isn't wearing this in the photograph that I just showed you, but this jacket actually is waist length, so you can see it's quite short. It's made of blue wool, and it has, of course, the red trim surrounding the collar and brass shank buttons. And it's important for a variety of things. Number one, the 12 brass buttons each have an American eagle on it, and I'll show you a picture of that. But it also has inside the jacket, here's the buttons and a close-up of the buttons. And we do know that a lot of the buttons, especially for Connecticut military and along the Union, were supported, of course, by the brass valley and print. And buttons are these very particular things and amazing to date in terms of company and shape and size. So you can see the eagle here. Grabbing, of course, the olive branch and the arrows, which is very Civil War associated. There's also a shield across his chest with 2 wings, and of course the eagle celebrating, valor and strength and American history here, and the feelings of how America supported itself, and a symbol of our Union when it moves forward. And with this jacket, you can see that it was actually very well cared for. On the inside of the jacket, you can see, of course, the striped lining, but also this checked pattern. So the actual holes and the damage that had been done had been cared for and supported by patches, either during the Civil War or just after. Another really fun thing about Gideon's jacket, his artillery jacket, is his name, which is inscribed on the inside. And you see G. Nichols, 2nd Light Battery, CV. And just that in itself is really interesting. And that is actually inside the breast of the jacket. So if you were to open the left front of your jacket pocket, on the inside, just as the wool folds over, you can actually see here, this is where the buttons would go through on the left side of the jacket. And if you were to open up your little inside lining, that is where it's inscribed with his name. And so it's really great to know that, number one, we do know it belonged to him, and of course the battalion and the militia that he served with during the Civil War. And knowing that, with all of our Civil War historians, we can certainly, in history that was documented, understand what the men and what the service members went through at Gettysburg, and also other places that they served and fought as well. And we also have Gideon's forage cap, which is, again, such a cool item, and to be able to support his history and his story. So he's, of course, not wearing this cap in the photograph that we have of him either. But this cap, which is also dark blue wool, so it does match the jacket, it's got its short visor across the front. There's a strap above the visor, which is of black leather, and it also has a small brass buckle as well. On the inside of the hat, it is marked with M&G number 3 New York, which is the maker of the hat. And it does have the artillery, the front of the cap has a brass crossbar artillery insignia, which is a pretty cool part. And of course, it also has the buttons as well, the brass buttons as well. Again, you see the eagle facing in a particular direction with the arrows and grasping the olive. Again, another Civil War key component and very datable to Gideon's lifetime. So another item that we have of Gideon's, a little object, a very important object, and also featured in the photograph with Gideon, is his sword. So this sword's about 3 feet long. It's pretty heavy, I will let you know, as I just lifted it and photographed it as well. And the sword and the scabbard itself is really interesting. So you can tell a lot about a service member and a military member by the style of the weapons that they carry, especially in swords. I do have a slight military history background, mostly in the 17th century. And as swords, of course, as time goes on, there are different changes in style due to the different styles of combat that soldiers are fighting, especially those who are in cavalry. So this sword is actually believed to have been a heavy cavalry dragoon enlisted man's artillery saber, and it certainly dates to the Civil War. It's great because it's in the photograph with Gideon. So the hilt itself is brass, and it's a semi-basket type, which means it does have a crossguard that actually supports and protects the hand and the holder's arm, as well as its wrist and fingers. You can see that the braided leather around the handle is actually in rather good shape, and that the blade, here's another picture of the basket handle, as well as the pommel on the back. That's the end of the sword here, which is weighted to help support the weight of the blade as well in use. The equanimity between the sword and the blade, the weight, and the pommel and the basket is really important for use during any type of combat for a soldier. And so this sword and scabbard, it's the actual style of the blade, as well as what's inscribed in here, again, is Solingen, which is a great, basically the place in Germany that blades were made for swords. It's a very important part of military history and sword history and blade history in world history, Solingen, Germany. And the maker's name is always usually stamped near the crossguard of the blade as well. And it was imported by what we think is Horsemen of Philadelphia. The blade itself is rather long, and this is, of course, the inside of the crossguard there and the hilt where the blade connects to the leather and there. But the sword itself, the blade, you can see, actually don't have a picture of it, but the blade itself is curved, and it has two grooves in fillers, one large and one small, and is pointed. So this is something that was not dress. This was in use as a cavalry member of the dragoons. And we can get a little bit of insight into Gideon's life as a soldier and that he would have carried this sword. So again, if we'd like to see the photograph of Gideon here and his sword, you can see a little bit of its height. So if we know that the sword is actually about 36 inches, 3 feet long, we can actually think about how tall is Gideon in comparison. But you can see the height, and of course the sword is in its scabbard as well there. So when he joined, you can actually see the hook as well, where the sword would have been hooked to his belt here. And of course, he's not wearing the jacket that we have, nor is he wearing the hat. But we do know, of course, that soldiers were provided and kept, their uniforms as well as had other options to wear. And so that concludes this History Bites and our little showcase of Gideon Nichols, his service, his life, and his contribution as a soldier in Civil War history and to Fairfield's history. And if you're interested and you have any particular questions that I didn't answer today, we also have several other objects related to Gideon Nichols and his military history. So I'd be happy to share some photos of those if I can. They are currently at our offsite storage, so I'd be happy to do a little digging and share those with you at a future date as well. But this does conclude our History Bites on Gideon Nichols and Civil War and Memorial Day history here in Fairfield. And if you have any questions, again, any comments or any suggestions, I'd be happy to hear them. I hope all is well with you and your family, and it was great to spend some time with you today.